We were looking at dualism, we looked at behaviorism, mind-brain identity theory, the type identity theory, and then functionalism as a response to that. And today we're going to look at papers by Armstrong and Lewis, two different papers that hopefully you read, and they're going to motivate a different kind of identity theory that sort of tries to deal with the problems that the type identity theory encountered and takes the advantages of all of the views, or tries to at least, as to the advantage of functionalism, the advantage of behaviorism, but also the advantage of the identity theory. Okay, so just to recap quickly, behaviorism roughly identified mental states with behavioral dispositions. Now, I just say roughly because, in a way, they want to bracket out talk of mental states altogether and just explain human behavior where we normally appeal to mental states simply in terms of inputs and outputs, behavior or behavioral dispositions. Now, one advantage of this is that at least it tries to make the investigation of the mind scientifically acceptable. Instead of sitting like Descartes, introspecting on your internal mental states and just reporting on them, here we can actually just look at behavior and that's scientifically acceptable. Of course, the problem with the view is, was that rain all of a sudden? Oh well, summer couldn't last forever. Okay, so the disadvantage was it misses out on inner mental states. That seems weird. We don't appeal to inner mental states at all, and we saw that behaviorism can't even explain the behavior of a Coke machine unless it appeals to internal mental states. So good luck with trying to explain human behavior. Identity theory identifies types of mental states with types of brain states, and it just says they're one and the same thing. They're numerically identical. There's no difference. Now, the advantage here, of course, is it makes the investigation of the mind essentially the job of neuroscience, and certainly scientifically tractable. Then there were worries. We looked at Kripke's worry about mere contingent identity, so the identity claim, the strict numerical identity claim, seems to be false. And then, more pertinently, perhaps, the multiple realizability claim pushed by people like Putnam, functionalists, that, well, look, if it's type identity, then it's C fibers firing or something in human beings. But then if octopuses or aliens or something don't have C fibers, then we're disallowing them from feeling pain or something, and that seems weird. And at best, you end up with a mere token physical identity, not even brain identity or neural identity, because you want to allow possibly for the for AI systems or robots or something having mental states. So then we looked at functionalism, which is able to have or deliver multiple realizability. Mental states here are characterized by their causal role, their job description. So we don't look at what a brain state is made out of, like the identity theorists. It's made out of brainy stuff, okay? We look at what it does, and we define it in that way, in the same way that we don't define a clock by what it's made out of, but we define a clock by its success in doing what it should do, in successfully performing its job description. This allows for multiple realizability because as long as that causal role or job description can be executed in some system, then that system will count as having the relevant mental state, just as a clock can be made out of anything and count as a clock. Now, the worry we briefly looked at, when we looked at Ned Block's objection to functionalism, was that it maybe leaves out phenomenal consciousness. So the thing that we're going to look at more next week when we look at Jackson's argument for epiphenomenal qualia. But the idea that there's something it's like to be in pain, or to eat a banana, or to smell blue cheese, or equivalently smelly socks or something. And that seems to get left out maybe from the functionalist view. And then there's the worry which we'll look at today that allows for too much multiple realizability. So we'll see what that means when we get to it. But that's just a recap of where we are and where we've got to. So we saw that functionalism is a black box theory in the sense that it doesn't say anything about what it is that mediates these functions between inputs, outputs, and other mental states. All it says is you get inputs into a system, into the black box. You get outputs from it, we're going to allow, unlike the behaviorist, for internal states of that black box. And then there's something that mediates those functions between the inputs, the outputs, and then relations between the other mental states. So you get an input of a nail, that causes a mental state of pain, causes a belief that you just sat on a nail, interacts with a desire to get away from the source of the pain, causes an output of behavior. Now, one way of filling out these details we saw was the one that Putnam wanted to push, machine functionalism. He was writing about this at the time that there was early work on AI. And so he wanted to have all of this specified in terms of machine table states. So that was one way of doing it. And we looked at a few, but the other one I want to just draw attention to and remind you of before we move on for today was the idea, the last one I showed when I was doing the functionalism lecture, realizer functionalism. So here, the idea is that we define a mental state by the high-level properties, as it were, of the mental state, its causal role as described psychologically, say, and then we look for whatever it is that actually realizes that causal role or that job description in the system we're looking at. And then what we do is we identify the mental states with that realizer substrate, okay, realization base, as philosophers will call it. So we define it psychologically in terms of the causal role. So pain is the state X such that it's typically caused by things like sitting on nails, and it typically causes outputs like screaming and jumping up. And it interacts with other mental states like desires and beliefs in such and such a way where we define desires and beliefs also in some functional analysis. So that's all psychological. We just define the state by its causal role in a psychological theory, but then we don't just stay there. We actually fill out the details of the black box by looking at what it is in fact for human beings, say, that realizes those functions, the realization base of the function. And for human beings, it seems like the most plausible thing you could possibly look at is the brain. The brain, the thing inside our skulls, seems to have something really important to do with the mind, okay? And so the realizer functionalist will say that that's the thing we should ultimately identify mental states with. So you can see we're kind of reverting to a sort of identity theory, okay? But it's not going to be the simple type identity theory we looked at before. Okay, so here's David Armstrong, yet another Australian philosopher, famous Australian philosopher. And he's going to help to motivate this view for us. So he's aware of the worries with behaviorism, the lack of appeal to internal mental states, and yet it seems like these internal mental states of ours are real. And not only that, but it seems like they are the causes of behavior. Now, I didn't emphasize this too much when we looked at when we did the lecture on behaviorism, but when we define mental states as behavioral dispositions, look what's happening. A behavioral disposition, most theories of causation are what people call event causal theories. So events cause other events. So they are the causal relata that stand in a causal relation. The event of my throwing a glass down on the ground will cause the glass to smash, or the cat to jump in fright, or whatever it is. But a behavioral disposition isn't an event. And so it seems like behavioral dispositions themselves can't cause behavior. And what you end up having as a causal view on the behaviorist position is outputs, behavior, as it were, directly caused by inputs, stimuli, that the organism, let's say, or the system is presented with. The nice thing about the view that we're going to look at today is that it not only appeals to internal mental states, like the functionalist, but it allows these mental states to be the causes of behavior in a way that the behaviorist actually has no way of allowing for. So the idea is to, roughly speaking here, reject the identification of mind and behavior, the rough identification that I talked about a moment ago, that the behaviorist makes, but keep some kind of talk about the behavioral dispositions, but in a new way where we can talk about causation in a way that the behaviorist can't. Keep the logical connection between mental states and behavior or behavioral dispositions, but introduce the mind as an inner cause of behavior. And then, most importantly, this view is motivated by physicalism. It wants to be monist in the physicalist or materialist way, not dualist, obviously. And importantly, it wants to respect this idea that really, if we're looking for some realization base for our mental states, look, it's got to be the brain, surely, okay? So it's got to, this view is going to try and maintain neuroscientific plausibility. Okay, so we're looking for the best of both theories. Here I'm talking in terms of physicalism and behaviorism. Physicalism here, I'm meaning to pick out, as it were, the type identity theory we looked at before. And behaviorism, I'm just using that term to roughly pick out the behaviorist view, but also some aspects of the functionalist view, because they have things in common. Now, the main point of the quotation I've got here from Armstrong is that because we're going to define the mental state initially, our concept of the mental state, in terms of the psychological role it plays for us, but then we're going to look at the realization base of that thing, what it does is it turns the question of investigating the mind into an empirical question, okay, rather than merely a logical question or a conceptual analysis question. We define the concept, as it were, by conceptual analysis, just thinking about our concept, but then we look at what actually realizes that the thing that we're trying to pick out by our concept in the world. And that's an empirical question. It's a scientific question. Okay. So again, just brain states seem to be the most plausible candidates here, and we want to maintain neuroscientific plausibility. Okay, so now let's think about how to make these behavioral dispositions into something that's causally interesting. So you might have a disposition to behave in certain ways under certain conditions. An object can even have something like that, so brittleness or fragility. And we say a glass is fragile because under certain kinds of conditions, like being under a certain tensile pressure or something like that, or for example being hit by a hammer, it will break or tend to break. Now, by investigating what it is that might actually realize that behavioral disposition of a wine glass, say, we might find out that it's a particular kind of molecular structure, so weak molecular bonds or whatever it is. Now, the thing about that is that that sort of realization base can work as a cause of the glass breaking in a way that appealed just to a mere behavioral disposition can't. Okay, so the idea here roughly is to treat the sorts of behavioral dispositions that the behaviorist was talking about in terms of their realization bases, so that we can make them be actual causes of stuff. Wine glasses breaking, and also humans doing certain things. Okay. So here's how the story is supposed to go. You've got a dispositional property, say, of a wine glass, brittleness or fragility. The idea is that that dispositional property is realized by some categorical basis, weak molecular bonds maybe, and that realization base then can cause the wine glass to break under certain conditions. In a way that just the behavioral disposition by itself, we can't say that. The idea is to make this sort of story work for mental states as well. So you have dispositional property of pain, so if walking, limp, if bump toe, cry out, whatever. And the idea here is to find out whether these dispositions also have a categorical basis that is analogous to the realization base or categorical basis of brittleness or fragility. The proposal here is that because the most obvious place to look seems to be the brain, they will say that the categorical basis is whatever, C fibers firing, some neural state or activity. So that's what the story is going to be like. And here, the events occurring in the brain, the categorical basis of the behavioral disposition can count as a legitimate cause. And this is why this is called the causal theory, this new kind of identity theory. Okay, well, how is it an identity theory? We'll see in a moment. So we're trying to make the best of two methods here. Conceptual analysis, what's that? Well, that's just sort of sitting in your armchair, reflecting on your concept, and saying, asking yourself what it would take for that concept to apply to something, what the maybe necessary and jointly sufficient conditions of its application might be in the typical way of doing things philosophically. So a bachelor is an unmarried male of marriageable age or something. You have the two individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for the application of the concept bachelor. And you can do that without investigating the world. You don't have to go out and investigate properties of bachelors and see how tall they are or things like this. All you have to do is just ask yourself what it would take for the concept to apply. So the internal components of it. So conceptual analysis like that is just a process that you can engage in sitting in your chair. Standing up if you like to, but in any case. You don't have to go out and do empirical work. So here, the suggestion is that, let's say, take one mental state like pain, is the state that plays causal role P. Now here, we're kind of going functionalist, right? We're saying, yeah, that makes sense. It's better than the straight-up type identity claim. It's better than behaviorism. But remember, it's a black box. So we're not filling out what will do the work here. We're just saying that, yeah, the concept of pain is roughly that it fulfills a certain causal role in people who experience pain. When they have these sorts of inputs, they have those sorts of outputs when that state that's caused by the inputs interacts with other mental states. Fine, but then, making the best of the two methods at our disposal, we can also make use of a posteriori methods, empirical investigation, scientific research, actually start looking at the brain. And here, we might find, and here we're trying to borrow from identity theory, we might find that in fact, the state that plays causal role P is neural state N1, let's say. Well, what does this deliver us? This seems to deliver us something really like what we had before from the identity theorist, but in a different way. It gives us a kind of identity between pain and neural state N1. So by appealing to behavioral dispositions, but then looking at what, and defining our concept according to a functionalist analysis, then looking at what realizes that function, so looking at the realization base, we find out that it's neural state N1. And then that, in turn, ends up delivering something that looks really like the identity theorist's claim. And that's why it's a kind of identity theory. So this is the causal theory, which is a type of identity theory. A mental state is an internal state of a person apt for producing certain ranges of behavior. And we're appealing to these categorical bases of dispositions, these realization bases. So this is distinct from behavior or even a behavioral disposition. It's an actual neural realizer of a function. Okay, so that's Armstrong motivating the theory, and we're going to look at a particular version of this theory now with Lewis. And Lewis is going to flesh out some of the details helpfully. But for now, any questions about how this is roughly supposed to be working before we move on to Lewis? Yeah.
I'm just wondering, how is it just seems really similar to normal identity theory. Like, how's it different?
We're going to see in just a moment, right? So we saw that one of the problems with identity theory before was it didn't allow for multiple realizability. It couldn't explain how something that didn't have, say, neural state N1 could be in a state of pain. So an octopus, an alien, a robot, etc. But this theory is going to give us a way of getting multiple realizability even when we're appealing to identity. Okay? So good. This helps us move into the next section. Okay, so this is Lewis, David Lewis, and he proposes this test that he thinks any theory, adequate theory of mind, ought to be able to pass, the madman-martian test for a theory of mind. So what are these two cases, the madman case and the Martian case, and how are they supposed to help? Why should some theory, any theory, have to pass them? So here's mad pain. So a case of mad pain is where you have a person has the same experience and neural state as, let's say we investigate everybody here, everybody at Monash, or whatever it is, everybody in Melbourne, and everybody in the world, and we find out that it seems like, because of the correlation we find between people's reports of being in pain and their actually being in state N1, neural state N1, that the realization base of pain in humans seems to be neural state N1. Well, mad pain would be a case where somebody else is in that state, but they're not in that state because of the usual inputs, and they're certainly not giving the usual outputs. Okay, so they're behaving something like this guy here. Okay, maybe when if I'm a mad pain person, I go into neural state N1 and I have the internal experience, the phenomenal experience of pain, but I get it when somebody answers their phone beside me on the bus. And the output it gives is that I immediately start doing mathematics, right? So I hear somebody answer the phone on the bus and I immediately start doing mathematics. I'm in neural state N1 and it was caused by the person answering the phone. And it's the same state. I'm actually in the state that you would be in if somebody, if you sat on a nail or something. So I'm in a state of pain, but I'm not too bothered about it because I'm mad, right? And I actually just do mathematics. This is a case of mad pain where it's the same neural state, same experience as you would be in if you had inputs like sitting on nails and gave outputs like screaming in pain. Here, the mad person is in the same neural state and phenomenal state, but they from different inputs and it gives different outputs. That's why they're mad. Okay. Okay, so that's one case. Then there's the case of Martian pain. Here it's the inverse. Now we have the same causes, inputs, and the same behavioral outputs as you would have when you're in pain. So when the Martian sits on a nail, he jumps up and he screams in pain. And we say, okay, fine, this is a case of Martian pain, but here, maybe the Martian doesn't even have a brain at all. So it's definitely not neural state N1. They're in no neural state at all. And maybe what mediates the function is something like inflated foot cavities. These Martians have foot cavities, and they get inflated when they get inputs like nails sticking into them, and when their foot cavity gets inflated, then they jump up and start screaming. Okay. So these are two cases where if we met that Martian and we saw him or her behaving, we'd say, yeah, it looks like they're in pain, right? But then we investigate, there's no neural state N1, they just get inflated foot cavities. But we'd say, well, it seems like they're in pain though, right? And by the same token, we might want to say that the mad pain person, we've got to explain that case too, because even though they've got different outputs from different inputs, we identify that they're in exactly the same state that we're in when we get inputs like sitting on nails and give outputs like screaming. So Lewis thinks that both of these cases seem possible, at least, excuse me, and he thinks that a credible theory of the mind has to be able to deal with both of them and not deny them as possibilities. So what that means in the upshot is what he says here, that there's got to be some straightforward sense in which each of them is in pain, according to the theory. So let's see how that works. Well, let me just skip that slide actually because it's too much text. I'll post that one later on, but we don't need to look at it all now. Let's take the two rough views that we've got. Physicalism, identity theory, identifying the mind with the brain, and then behavior and causal role, taking kind of the best of functionalism and behaviorism. Well, which theory rules out which type of pain? So we've got these two cases, Martian pain and mad pain. So let's take identity theory, the kind of type identity theory that we looked at before. Which sort of pain would it rule out? Think about what identity theory says. It identifies a type of mental state with a type of neural state. So which of these cases would it rule out? So the identity theorist says, let's ditch talk about C fibers and say neural state N1. When humans are in pain, they're in neural state N1, and in fact, the type of mental state, being in pain, is identical. It's the very same thing as neural state N1. That's what it is to be in pain. Which of these possibilities, putative possibilities, would identity theory rule out? Martian pain. Why? Okay, I mean, look, everybody's got a 50-50 chance of getting the answer right here, right? There's only two options. You're right, but why? Why is it? It should be fairly obvious.
Martians don't experience brain state N1.
Yeah, you can put it like that. Martians don't experience, they don't have brain state 1, right? Because they don't have any brains, let's say. Let's just deny them brains altogether. And what we notice that it's inflated foot cavities. So pain, if we want to allow for Martian pain, cannot be identical to neural state N1 if Martians are in pain, because they don't have any neural state N1. They don't have any brains at all. Okay, so that's right. It rules out Martian pain, but it allows for mad pain. Why? Why does it allow for mad pain? Just because it says, well, if the agent is in neural state N1, that's what pain is. So regardless of what they're doing, mathematics, because they heard somebody answering their phone, that person is in pain because they're in neural state 1, and these things are identical. So it allows for mad pain, but it denies Martian pain. And of course, there's no prizes then for guessing which kind of pain behaviorism or the functionalist causal role idea rules out. It's obviously the inverse. But why? Why does it allow for Martian pain? Why? Remember, it's just, functionalism is just about a causal role, a job description being performed. Doesn't matter what it's made out of, let's say. Here, the Martian is getting inputs like sitting on nails, jumping up and screaming as an output. And so, whatever is going on in the Martian, that thing seems to be the thing that performs the functional or causal role that pain serves in us. Okay? So because it performs the causal role, the functional role well, serves that role, it seems like we want to say the Martian is in pain. And the behaviorist or even functionalist can say that, because they can allow for multiple realizability. Hey, look, if pain is realized by inflated foot cavities and that's what mediates the causal relations for Martians, that's good enough. Multiple realizability all over the place, doesn't matter. But of course, in the mad pain case, the functionalist has to deny that the person is in pain because the causal role seems not to be served. It's doing something weird, okay? When I experience intense pain, I say, mathematics, and I start doing mathematics, right? Instead of jumping up and running away. And so that is a very different kind of causal role, even though I'm in the same brain state, neural state N1. So these theories seem to, neither of them works in total in passing the dual test being proposed by Lewis. So behavior, causal role, functionalism rules out mad pain, but the identity theory rules out Martian pain. Yeah.
In terms of like mad pain and doing mathematics instead of like jumping up and going away, could you argue that by doing mathematics to distract themselves from the pain, since the same responses?
Okay, nice, good. So the suggestion here is that couldn't in some way the person suffering from mad pain who jumps up and does the mathematics, they're distracting themselves, so it's somehow performing the same kind of causal role as would be served in us in getting the person away in some sense from the pain. That might be true, maybe, in the case as I described it there. But we can fill out these details in any way we want, right? And we can just come up with a case where it seems like there's no plausible way in which the same kind of causal role that's served in us when we're in pain is served by the mad pain case. So maybe my example that I just came up with off the top of my head about phones and mathematics is not the best. But you can see, hopefully, that we could just come up with another case, and it'll be one that we'll say is truly mad, because there's no causal role being served there. Okay, good. That's a good criticism, though, of the way I had put it. Okay, so look, let's get back to the way that Armstrong was talking about it, and Lewis is adopting the same idea here. So the functionalist says that we just kind of identify pain with the functional role P. Okay? Now that can be realized multiply. That's one of the things, nice things about functionalism, is it allows us to have multiple realizability. So that functional role P can be realized in human brain states, alien brain states, robot brain states, and so on. Okay, so it gives us multiple realizability. It says that pain is not identical to C-fiber activation or neural state N1, whatever it is, in the way that the identity theorists claimed. But it just so happens that in us, maybe, C-fiber activation or neural state N1 is what realizes or implements pain, because it implements that functional role. Whereas for an alien or an octopus or something, it might be neural state N2 or Z-fibers firing, and so on. Now, the causal theory is making a different claim, and I'm contrasting them here just so that we can see the sort of move that it's making. So they, first of all, do their conceptual analysis, and what they do is, instead of identifying pain with functional role P, like the functionalist, they identify our concept of pain, our notion of pain, with functional role P. So you just do that conceptual analysis, and you say, I'm not going to make the identification of the mental state with that functional role, but I'm going to define our concept in terms of that functional role. It's the state such that when people do things like sit on nails, they tend to jump up and scream because they had other mental states, etc. So you identify the concept of pain with the functional role. Again, you can have that functional role, of course, be realized multiply in different realization bases, in humans, in aliens, and so on. And pain ends up being identical in a different sense than the type identity theorist was claiming with those brain states or those physical states, let's say in the case of the robot, where there's no brain, maybe it's just a silicon chip or something. So pain is not identified with causal role P, but with whatever states realize that causal role. How is this different from the original identity theorists' claim? Yeah, so they were making a numerical identity claim where the identity was strict identity with just, it can only be one thing, of course. But here it's kind of a weird identity claim. It's the kind of identity claim you think somebody couldn't make, maybe, right? How do you mean it's identical with any of these different brain states? So let's see how that works. But that's the kind of claim they want to make. They're going to claim that their pain, attributions of pain are going to be relative to species, let's say. So a natural kind of thing like a species or a population. Okay, now just before we sketch out all that, I've got a big long quote here from Lewis, but he's just saying what I just said a moment ago there, that we define the concept of pain, okay, in terms of the causal role, just like the functionalist does. Okay, and then you say, well, what is that? It's the concept of a state apt for being caused by certain stimuli and apt for causing certain behavior. That is just purely kind of behaviorist. So that's entirely behaviorist friendly. But he goes on then and he gives what sounds much more like a functionalist version of it, or better, a state apt for being caused in certain ways by stimuli and other mental states, and apt for combining with other mental states to jointly cause various behaviors. So that's how you define the concept. And that's part of what he calls our common sense psychology. Okay? And that's how we're defining our concept. So you do that first, and then you look at the realization base, like I said. Now, you might worry, as I just indicated a moment ago, about this identity claim. How can you make this identity claim? The first issue seems to be, well, look, it seems like it's a mere contingent identity claim. Kripke talked about rigid and non-rigid designators, where basically that meant that a proper name, let's say, or the name of a natural kind, like a particular species, or a particular type of thing, like water. So those are examples of natural kinds. Those identities are rigid in the sense that they're necessarily true. strictly speaking, true in all possible worlds. So Superman is identical to Clark Kent. That's necessarily true. And a claim like water is H2O is also going to be necessarily true. But when we have just some definite description, the such and such, the blah, 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 is identical to the blah, 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 those identity claims are entirely contingent. So obviously, it's not necessarily true that the Terminator was the 38th governor of California. The 38th governor of California could have been anybody, right? Okay, so these claims are contingent. Now, Kripke had said that pain is going to work like a natural kind term, and it's going to be rigid. So it's going to be, if the identity theorist wants to make that claim, it's got to be a claim that's necessarily true. And Lewis says, actually, no. He just says, no, you're wrong about that. It's not rigid. It's not necessarily true. He thinks that the concept of pain isn't some concept of a neural state or something. It's just the serving of this functional role in our common sense psychology. And if that is C fiber firing, that's fine, but that's totally contingent. He thinks that it could also be something else, and so you get multiple realizability, a contingent identity claim, not a necessarily true identity claim. So that's where the difference comes between the type identity theorist's claim, and it doesn't devolve immediately into a mere token identity. So token identity is where, oh yeah, look, when that thing is in pain, it's in some brain state. But that's not very interesting, okay? It gives us no way to categorize things other than just case by case, individual by individual. The type identity theorist gives us a huge, broad way of categorizing things, but it's too broad, and it leaves out saying that octopuses could be in pain. But this gives us a kind of a contingent identity claim that says, well, maybe pain is C fibers firing in humans, Z fibers firing in octopuses, and silicon chips having certain kinds of electrical impulses in robots, etc. Okay? But we'll see that the claim is also supposed to be relative to those populations, as we'll see in just a moment. Okay, so it's a relative claim. Pain in humans maybe is C fiber firing. Pain in octopuses is the activation of some other kind of nerve cell. Inflated foot cavities in Martians, and so on for each individual type of entity or species or creature. Now, what makes them all examples of pain is that they all play the same functional role. They all satisfy our concept of pain. Our concept of pain applies to them all, but because that function that defines our concept of pain is realized by some different realization base in each type of thing, Martians, humans, octopuses, etc. So it's a restricted, species-specific type identity claim. It's not a mere token claim. It's not a really strong, necessarily true, numerically identical identity claim, which is going to be a full type claim. It's a species-relative type claim. So let's see how he deals with these problem cases then. He said any theory has got to pass explain these two cases, mad pain and Martian pain. So he's got to be able to explain them himself. Okay, so mad pain and Martian pain. He thinks that the concept of pain can apply to different states in different cases, as long as the state that implements the functional role does so for a population, some population, okay? So it's species-specific pain, and here's how it goes. It's ambiguous, because you talk about pain for humans, pain for octopuses, pain for Martians. So we say that X, any creature, is in pain if and only if X is in the state that occupies the causal role of pain in the appropriate population. How do you define the appropriate population? He's got, as he does in other work of his, he ends up having these competing criteria that are not supposed to be sort of necessary and jointly sufficient conditions or anything like that, but they can, we just sort of consider them, and then some of them might outweigh others and so on. So here are the criteria for the appropriate population. First of all, the appropriate population is going to be us, in many cases, because it's our concept. Okay? Fine. It might be, if we're considering some other creature, it might be that creature's population. So if it's, we're asking whether an octopus is in pain, we'll ask whether, we'll define the population relative to that creature, not to us. It'll also be a population, whether for us or for the octopus or any other creature, where the individual creature we're looking at is not exceptional, so they're not mad, okay? It's got to be a normal member of the population. And the population is supposed to be a natural kind. So a natural kind, again here, really just means species. A species is going to count as a natural way of categorizing the world, a way in which we are carving, as it were, the world at its joints. Like orangutans are a type of thing. They are a species, they're a natural kind, and they can constitute the relevant population here as well. Okay, so these are the 4 criteria. Now sometimes, well in any case, we're going to be ambiguous about pain. There's pain in us, pain in octopuses, pain in Martians, but also an attribution of pain. If we're considering whether a creature, a particular creature is in pain, we might say, in this case, I don't know. I don't know. There's no determinate answer if we find that it's an odd case where various of these criteria pull against each other in a certain way or something like that, and we just don't know. But you can see that as kind of a feature, not a bug of the theory Lewis is hoping, because in some cases we need to be ambiguous about pain, and in some cases there's vagueness and we just don't know whether something is in pain. We don't have enough information or knowledge to be able to decide. So what about Martian pain? Well, for Lewis, the Martian is in pain. He counts as being in pain. He's a normal member of a different population. So here, if you just jump back, you can see we're taking, not to be us, but X's population, okay? And the Martian is a perfectly normal, he's not mad, and the population is a natural kind. And we look at what implements our concept of pain in the Martian population, and we find that it's inflated foot cavities. He's in that state, so the Martian counts as being in pain. He's in a state that occupies the pain role for Martians. So he's in Martian pain. What about mad pain? Well, Lewis thinks that the mad guy is in pain too. The neural state that he's in doesn't occupy the usual causal role, so he's an exceptional member of a particular population. If you investigate me and you find out that I actually start doing mathematics or whatever the example is when I hear people answer their phones, you'll definitely count me as an unusual member of the population, okay? But if you find out that I'm in neural state N1, you'll say, nevertheless, notwithstanding my unusualness, okay, I am in the state that realizes the normal causal role in the normal population. And because of that, and because that neural state then is supposed to be the state that's going to be realizing my phenomenal state of pain as well, I'm in pain. I'm just a weird member of a normal population. So we get both Martian pain, according to Lewis, and mad pain. It's a little bit ambiguous because it's Martian pain and it's human pain in an unusual member of a normal population for the mad person, but they both count as being in pain for Lewis. Now you might worry, at the end of the article he talks about various other things, mad Martian pain. What happens if the Martian is mad? We've got both things going on here now, right? Well, he thinks that that's okay unless there are weird subpopulations, in which case then it might be indeterminate because we don't know what subpopulation the Martian belongs to. But if we look at the whole population and we realize inflated foot cavities is the realizer in these creatures of the causal role of pain that defines our concept of pain. And this creature is in that neural or that foot cavity state, but I've just heard somebody answering their Martian phone and they're doing Martian mathematics, so they're mad. Nevertheless, they might be in pain because we know that they've got an inflated foot cavity and inflated foot cavities is what underlies pain in the normal population. The application of our concept of pain in the normal population of Martians. Again, with this caveat that we need to know that there's not some weird subpopulation here, that he is really an outlier from the normal population. He kind of throws his arms up at the very end in the article. He considers whether you could have unique mad Martian pain. So in cases like this, he thinks, I don't know, maybe my theory just can't handle it. But that's fine because sometimes it's just indeterminate. But mad alien pain normally is okay as long as we don't have too much of it and as long as it's not too alien and too unique. So our concept has got to apply to it. There's got to be some causal role being served by some realization base. It can't be too unique and too alien. Okay, last thing. You might think that this is too unstable, that it's kind of ad hoc. It's delivering too much, but too easily, okay? It's like, hang on, you're trying to have your cake and eat it too, as I'd had on a previous slide. Well, he thinks no, because look, it's just not a necessary identity claim in the sort of way that Kripke thought correctly, that the type identity theorist was making. Role, the causal role, functional role, and the realizer can come apart. So you can kind of detach the realizer from the role and plug in a different realizer for it, okay? They can come apart and they're modular in this way. You can just sort of plug and play them in different ways. But one worry then is, okay, fine, you get multiple realizability from that kind of plug and play aspect, but it seems like it's also a form of chauvinism then, because you might want to say it's not dolphin pain that dolphins are in when a certain causal role is being served by some state in them. We want to say, if it's anything, it's the same pain as we're in. It's painy feeling, right? Hurtfulness, ouchiness, okay? And if we want the paininess to be like what these other creatures have, not some special kind of dolphin paininess, which is not our kind of paininess. So you might think it's a kind of crypto-chauvinism. And, I mean, he's just going to throw his arms up and say, well, look, that's as much as we can get. Dennett has another view on this where, you say, well, it's not really maybe the same pain, but it's sort of pain and it's good enough, okay? Okay, any last questions before we leave that for today? Next week, we're going to look at qualia and the knowledge argument, if I can get my slides to work. Can the physicalist and the functionalist explain what it's like to do anything, including eat Vegemite? I never knew before I came to Australia, but now I do. Okay, so we'll come to that next week.